Say Yesher Koach to the cantor. Beautiful job on the Haftarah to all who participated in the Torah service. I want to wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. It's wonderful to be here with you today, together in this beautiful sanctuary. Before I start, I guess I want to ask for your forgiveness and for your patience, because I have a lot that I want to share with you today. So last week I was on a little vacation in Southern California and had Shabbat off. I watched my father-in-law, Cantor Herschel Fox, go off to work to his shul, my former shul, in LA. As I lingered with my coffee, and I thought about what I would say if I were on the bima. What insight does the Torah give us as we enter into the Abraham-Sarah narrative, the narrative of the founding father and mother of the Jewish people? God chooses or finds Abraham among the nations of man, or at least it seems. Alternatively, in the famous Midrash, a youthful Abraham appears to discover God before God discovers him, when he smashes his father's idols. Either way, Abraham partners with God by leaving his home, his culture, the values he was raised with. He leaves his past identity behind as God calls on him to be God's vessel in the world. God says, Heye bracha, be a blessing. And in case you missed it, God says in the next sentence, V'nivrechu v'cha kol mishpachot adama, and through you, all the families of the world shall be blessed. But then there's this week, Parshat Vayera. Here we arrive at what I call the anxiety parsha. Is all this really going to come true? Is God going to keep God's word and ensure that this people, this message, carry on for another generation? Sarah can't get pregnant. Then she finally does at 90 years old. And right away after Isaac is born, Abraham's called by God to sacrifice him. Is this really going to work out for this newly born Hebrew tribe? Yes, the Jewish people are called to be a blessing and partners with God, but from the very beginning, nothing seems to come easily to them. The anxiety of our survival and continuity is seemingly built into the system of our existence. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And later in the book of Exodus, Pharaoh is emblematic of our greatest anxiety and insecurity because he represents the foundation of other nations' Jew hatred. And I do prefer the term Jew hatred over anti-Semitism because it's more precise. But you'll probably hear me in this talk go back and forth. And Jew hatred is what brings us to today in our current anxiety. See, the question of Abraham is the question of who we are in the world. What is the core of our Jewish identity and purpose in the world? And how are we supposed to achieve that purpose? And that question of our existential purpose as a unique people is inescapably interconnected and interwoven with the question of, why is it so hard? If we're supposed to be a blessing and others will be blessed through us, why is it so hard? Why is it that we keep attracting the enmity and hatred and violence of the rest of the world like a lightning rod? And now is the time to answer that question. Because a month ago, we watched the most brutal, barbaric pogrom, including the most heinous, monstrous atrocities of the flesh imaginable. And it happened within the Jewish state itself, where these things aren't supposed to happen. Where Jews, men, women, babies in their pajamas were indiscriminately hunted in their homes. afterward, the world seemed to embrace and support the Jewish people for a couple days. But then came the truly sad scenes from Gaza and Israel's response. And much of the world has now turned away its support, leaving many of us to feel alone, isolated, and abandoned. In the past few weeks, we've heard many justifications for the pogrom, which is that Israel is a colonialist state that oppresses Palestinians. Never mind that Hamas's declared platform is to wipe Israel off the map from the river to the sea. Never mind that Hamas uses Palestinian civilians as human shields. Never mind that there's an entire educational industry wherein much of the Arab world professes a distorted version of history, that Zionism is a malevolent political philosophy, that the state of Israel is illegitimate, and that Jews are rotten thieves. Never mind that Israel is the only democracy in the region where the people actually have a say in their governance by voting, where LGBTQ rights, women's rights matter. Never mind all that. Israel appears to be whiter and richer, so it must be wrong. Some have, of course, outright applauded Hamas, representing a poisonous concoction of inhumanity, ignorance, and unabashed Jew hatred. Though what we hear most commonly is a simplistic moral philosophy of but. There was a terrible thing that happened, but. But the attack was expected, it was deserved, but it doesn't justify a military response, but. And as we all know, once you put a but in a sentence, everything that comes before it is diminished and erased. Of course, it's infuriating that many of those using the but argument have no solution as to how Israel should defend its borders and ensure this doesn't happen again, or how Hamas should be held to account, or offer a strategy for freeing the hostages. And it's heartbreaking for all of us. But more than anywhere, the feeling of isolation and heartbreak and abandonment has been experienced for Jews on college campuses. On college campuses, and even in some high schools and middle schools, we've seen unrelenting castigation and criticism of Israel and Jews. It's a castigation that seemingly justifies the slaughter of Jews, or in some spaces denies the massacre happened, as it actually happened, both of which are anti-Semitic expressions of Jew hatred. And so, it's time to answer for our kids, for our young people. Why do people hate Jews? Where does anti-Semitism come from? And it's particularly critical now because many have never seen Jew hatred. They haven't had to know it. I'm 50 years old. I'm a Gen Xer. I have experienced severe anti-Semitism, but I'm an exception. Most Gen Xers haven't known anti-Semitism, and less so millennials or Gen Z. So what is it that feeds Jew hatred, and why doesn't it go away? Let me take it piece by piece. First, we have to mention what Pope John Paul II referred to as the teaching of contempt, based upon the latter Christian Gospels of Luke and John, which is that Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. So this is essentially 2,000 years of teaching, particularly on Good Friday, which is as close to Yom Kippur that Christians get, where priests would read this story that puts Jews front and center at Jesus' death. That's powerful. Just think if during the Passover Seder there were ancient Egyptians around, and that Jews were in the majority and in control of society. You could imagine that some Jews would want to go out and exact vengeance on those Egyptians. And so there is a Christian anti-Semitism that exists, and it rears its head from time to time. Then there's an economic version of anti-Semitism. A very brief thumbnail sketch goes something like this. In the Middle Ages, Europe didn't produce an economy that sustained itself because it didn't reinvest the money that it made. In other words, you can't just build castles and suits of armor because that just uses up the money and doesn't produce anything you can sell and make more money. Not until the Industrial Revolution did Europe sort this out. So, now if you use up your money building castles and armor, eventually you run out and you have to go borrow money. Well, the Christian church ruled against usury for Christians, which is basically lending money for interest. Meanwhile, at the same time, Jews were prohibited from owning and farming land and from working many trade professions. So we were often left to usury for work, banking, rent collecting, and money lending. And Jews lent a lot of money, and many people couldn't pay it back. So in 1205, Pope Innocent III issued what's called a papal bull that says that no one needs to pay the Jews back. Why? Well, because the Jews killed Christ. And this effectively expropriates Jewish funds and wipes out all debt. And that pretense was used again and again by subsequent popes such as Paul IV and Pius V. But this money lending label set Jews up to be seen as hoarders and profiteers and dangerous to society. It therefore became reasonable and justified to expropriate money from Jews and not to settle debts to them. And this is why we were also expelled from Spain. The Inquisition wasn't just about converting Jews. It was about wiping out debt and confiscating Jewish property. And for many scholars, Hitler's Jew hatred, in addition to being unquestionably fueled by personal prejudice, was also motivated by his understanding that he could expropriate the wealth from the German Jewish community, use it to arm the Reich, and invade Europe. In fact, Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, said this very thing just over a month ago, just before the attack. Abbas, who wrote his doctoral dissertation, his thesis at a Russian university titled The Secret Relationship Between Nazism and Zionism, was on Palestinian TV explaining the origins of the Holocaust. The Nazis, he said, were not anti-Semitic. Really? But opposed the Jews, quote, because of their role in society which had to do with usury, money. In Hitler's view, he continued, they were engaged in sabotage, and this is why Hitler hated them. That's what he said. Finally, Jew hatred exists and doesn't go away because of something that many people of color and minorities truly understand. It's the impulse to categorize. It's the natural human impulse to make a pecking order. These people are below us. Those people are below you. And those people are below them. And we Jews were the lowest of the low of Europe, the bottom of the pecking order. In America, black people have been the bottom of the pecking order. And so in the middle of the 20th century in America, Ashkenazi Jews were able to use what people refer to as white skin privilege in order to elevate ourselves and achieve assimilation. But all of a sudden, something happens, and people say, you know what, you Jews are still below us. Probably because of so many friendships that I have and the interfaith work that I've done, I don't believe that most modern Christians consume anti-Semitism as a foundational idea in their upbringing. I happen to believe that the modern increase in Jewish hate incidents, certainly in Europe and around the world, as well as in much of America, is largely fueled by the Israel-Arab conflict and by anti-Semitism in the Arab world. As for today, what we've been living through in America, particularly in post-World War II America, which let's not forget is only about 65 years, is a very small bubble of freedom for Jews. It also occurred in Germany before World War II, called the Weimar period, where Jews had extraordinary privileges. It happened in medieval Spain at the time of the poet Ibn Gabirol and part of Maimonides' life. But what we've been living in a bubble until now. Frankly, to even ask the question why people hate Jews, given what we know about the common experience of Jewish history, is a question of luxury. It's a luxury of our time. It's a question from the bubble where generations haven't experienced serious Jew hatred. Many of our parents and grandparents may remember such a time in America when Jews weren't allowed into certain universities and schools. Jews weren't allowed to join certain clubs, play on certain golf courses, live in certain neighborhoods, be hired for certain businesses, work in certain hospitals. But for many in the baby boomer generation down, lots of American Jews don't have lived experience of Jew hatred. And now for millennials and Gen Z Jews especially, they're shocked to have such a lived experience, and they're not sure how to respond. Some, with the declared intention of peace, have sadly joined the forces of those who blame Jews in Israel for Hamas's massacre, and even have helped to spread blood libels, such as the one that accused Israel of bombing a Palestinian hospital. That's what that was, a blood libel. Others are confused and paralyzed. They've lost friends over it. They're afraid to speak about it in public. They're shocked. But my grandparents would not be shocked. And what is especially disturbing to young American Jews is that they always thought that anti-Semitism would arise among the religious or the right. Because that's what we saw in Charlottesville. That's what we saw in flyers blaming Jews for the world, for COVID, forest fires with Jewish space lasers. But where it's coming from is on college campuses, which are anything but religious and largely of the left. We're seeing that the people who we thought were our allies in fighting social justice were ready to blame Israel for everything. Even before Israel had a military response, they were blaming them. And they've been so harsh in their demonstration, lauding Hamas's creativity and proclaiming gratuitous barbarism to be a legitimate form of liberation. They seem to ignore all of the nuance of the conflict and reduce their argument to anti-Semitic tropes, throwing around terms such as imperialist, colonialist, genocidal. And those anti-Semitic tropes have a history going back to Russia and Stalin, who established a so-called academic approach to critically studying Zionism. Look up Soviet anti-Zionism. Read Isabella Tabarovsky, who wrote a piece specifically about this in Tablet just last September. And a current incarnation of this sort of rhetoric is the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, which claims Zionism to be, quote, a political ideology enmeshed with racism, fascism, and colonial dispossession. And that Zionism is central to such societal ills as racism, colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and the appropriation of liberatory rhetoric by repressive political forces, among other harms, end quote. Their approach and aim is to decouple and put a wedge between Zionism and Judaism so that it doesn't appear anti-Semitic. In other words, for them, you can be anti-Zionist, but you're not anti-Semitic. But such a complete decoupling, if you know Jewish history and Jewish texts, is not only weird, but impossible. And so therefore, behind the veil, if you associate being Jewish with Zionism, that Jews support Israel, that Jews have a legitimate claim to the land of Israel, that Jews are Zionists, then you realize that this is unadulterated anti-Semitism. It's basically the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was first published in Russia in 1903 in new pseudo-academic clothes. Remember what I said about Mahmoud Abbas' doctoral thesis and where he studied? And this anti-Semitic conception of Zionism is being echoed in universities. Perhaps we diminished it. Perhaps we ignored it, because many of us are politically progressive, and universities represent progressive values. Maybe we didn't want to believe it to be true, because universities are where there's supposed to be an open exchange of ideas with critical thinking, aiming towards shared universal values. But this is precisely where it's happening, where future leaders are being nurtured. And it's been happening for decades. I deeply and sincerely sympathize with the plight and suffering of Palestinian civilians. I wouldn't want to be a resident of Gaza. But what's especially troubling is that the rhetoric doesn't stick to the subject of Israeli violence and wrongdoing, of which there is some, or of some of Netanyahu's policies. It's not a conversation about a two-state solution or returning to 67 borders. It's about 1948 and the legitimacy of the Jewish state altogether. It's a rhetoric that leads to swastikas on synagogues and school campuses, to mobs in Europe to this day calling for death to the Jews, to Palestinians, you remember this, driving around the streets of Los Angeles calling out, "Who's Jewish?" Like they're in the hunt. All of which I haven't heard those same pro-peace, pro-Palestinian groups denounce. Hamas leader Ghazi Hamad said in an interview just this week that Israel, quote, is a country that has no place in our land, promising for a second, third, and fourth October 7th-like massacre. And yet the voices for peace are silent. The way I see it, to be just anti-Zionist is either a product of naivete, of its inherent anti-Semitism, or it's a deliberate veil to anti-Semitism. Zionism is the case for Jewish liberation and self-determination in a Jewish homeland, not Jewish world dominance. My personal pet theory for Jew hatred actually goes back to Abraham and that midrash of breaking his father's idols, of leaving his culture and its values. That, for me, is the defining story of what it is to be a Jew. We are idol smashers. Literally iconoclasts. Jews question and doubt and shatter established norms and alter the way the world sees itself. 3 Jews, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Albert Einstein, changed the whole Western world in politics, psychology, and physics. Arthur Schoenberg created the 12-tone scale, shattering the way people think about music. Philip Roth smashed the idol of Jewish middle-class sensibilities in his novels. Lenny Bruce broke the idols of traditional comedy, and then Sacha Baron Cohen did it again. Jews seem to come along and shake up the status quo, breach cemented pillars of how the world organizes itself, and seed skepticism into normative systems and beliefs. We have changed the way the world thinks and works. So the world may understandably ask, what are these Jews up to? What are they getting out of this? Can we really trust these Jews? They tear down our norms and idols. They're not one of us, always upsetting the apple cart, always questioning, looking for a different way. For us as Jews, though, we don't see anything wrong with it, and actually think breaking the status quo is a valuable contribution. But not everyone knows. For many, breaking idols is threatening and arrogant. So what are we to do? besides donating and advocating for Israel? First of all, go to shul. I mean it. Be with other Jews in Jewish places. Now's the time to appreciate this beautiful tradition and path we have. And support the shul. We need to ensure our security and our existence. Support the institutions whose clear and present mission is central to the Jewish mission, which is to educate and celebrate Jewish life. And the synagogue in America is the premier address for that. Second, let's remember our forefather Abraham. Heye bracha. Be a blessing. Not just to yourself, but to others. Remind yourself that the Jewish mission is to recognize the Tselem Elohim, the divine and sacred image, that's stamped on every human being. Even when you're angry. Even when you're afraid. Now is the time to live our spiritual maxims. Love your neighbor as yourself. Be wholehearted in your faith. Fill your life with healthy commitments bound by our covenant found within community. Torah, prayer, and acts of loving kindness. This is no time to take our Jewish community, our synagogue, and our spiritual path for granted. This is the time to double down and triple down on it. We don't have the same luxury of laissez-faire Judaism and Jewish identity. That bubble burst a month ago. And it will take time until we politically, sociologically, and tactically figure out how all this happened and how we're going to move forward from here. But for now, we are Am Echad, one people, Belev Echad, with one heart, the Am Yisrael Chai, and our people lives on. Today, we're at the Parsha of anxiety. The question of whether the promises will come true brings us back to Abraham's covenant with God, and maybe more importantly, with each other. I need you. And we need each other. We always have. And somewhere deep inside, we've always known that we are bound together in our brit. But now we have to transform the consciousness of our covenant into a lived commitment. Shabbat shalom.